First of all, I wanted to thank Robert and Massimo for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be here and to present a work in progress. So have a little bit of patience, it's not complete. It's a real question I am personally working with in this time. Religious narratives and performances are circulating within different fields in society, and they are not an exclusive patrimony of religious communities or institutions. One may find religion in very different domains of society. So the question I would like to address within this conference on semiotics focuses on the understanding of religion within these forms of transmission that are not entirely related to religious actors. How should we describe communication processes putting religion on artistic or political or economical stages? Even is it very fashionable within European university to state that religion interacts with culture, it seems to me that there is some resistance in analyzing meaning-making processes mediated by religious references outside religious institutions. How should we understand religious communication in these particular settings? How to approach this aspect of religion in culture? There are some questions about appropriate theories, methods, and the analysis of this kind of science. In such context, I would like to discuss and present today with you. I've chosen a circular procedure, so I will firstly present you the material, the empirical data, some images, and then I will go to theory, very shortly of course, discuss a little bit method, and then come back to the images and try to draw some conclusion. So I'm working in visual fields in religion, so that my examples are drawn from this particular perspective on religion, and I will use some examples drawn from my current research project on the representation of the Passion of the Christ in culture, particularly in audiovisual media. So I will just show you the sources to give you a taste of this kind of particular material, of this kind of circulation of religion outside religion institution. And in this paper, the focus on the theoretical and methodological aspects, even if my principal goal and interest is to describe and interpret religious communication in contemporary European culture. So let's go to the first example. It's a feature film, a Canadian feature film, Jésus de Montréal, by Denis Arcand. It's a Canadian director from Quebec, made in 1989. It is a very interesting film in manifold perspectives. Particularly on the stylistic level, the film combines, in a very refined way, different approaches to the life and the passion of Jesus. It tells the story of Daniel, a very gifted but uncompromising actor who is assumed by a Catholic priest to perform a traditional Passion play during the summertime. Daniel looks for a few good actors, fellows, and with them he completely renewed the Passion play. He confronts himself deeply with the text of the Gospels, considers academic approaches to exegesis and the sacred text, and in the end he presents a very strong piece that is received enthusiastically by audience, by believers, by media, and by drama critics. By performing himself Jesus, Daniel offers a radical reading of the Savior, with a strong criticism toward institutions and particularly toward the Roman Catholic Church, which of course leads to a major conflict. Moreover, his life outside the stage is presented in this film in some way as an actualization of the patient, so the title is referred to this reality within the film. At the end, the protagonist dies because of an accident on stage. He falls down from the cross, and he offers his life to save other people across the world. So I show you the first clip. It's just the beginning of it.
C'est un spectacle que j'ai monté il y a 35 ans et qu'on a toujours appelé ici chuté. Mais les dernières années, ça marche pas très fort. Le texte est un peu démodé. Je voudrais moderniser tout ça.
Première station. Jésus est condamné à mort.
So you see the structure, this is Daniel looking for the older version of the Passion Play he would like to renew on a television screen. In the next clip I've chosen, I will show you how the boundaries between the Passion Play and the filmic reality are blurred. Daniel is performing scenes with miracles made by Jesus.
Jésus, viens-moi. Je te vois.
Ne vous tournerez pas. Personne, en s'inquiétant, ne peut ajouter une heure à la longueur de sa vie.
Il fait comme nous. Lève-toi.
Jésus, mon bon Jésus, je suis à toi. Je t'appartiens. Pardonne-moi, Jésus, pardonne-moi, j'ai péché. Pardonne-moi, Jésus, pardonne-moi, Jésus, pardonne-moi, Jésus. Jésus, pardonne-moi, j'ai péché, pardonne-moi. Jésus, pardonne-moi. Pardonne-moi, Jésus. Pouvez-vous pardonner? Jésus, Jésus, pardonne-moi, je t'aime. C'est toute ma vie.
I would like to outline two main stylistic procedures in this film. First, the film presents different levels of Passion plays. The Passion play is a dramatic, open-air performance of the life and passion of Christ, and the life of the cast members, but also of the audience, as you have seen, can be interpreted as a filmic actualization of Jesus in Montreal in the 80s of the last century. These levels of play, of passion play in the film are blurred, and at the end they merge completely. And the second stylistic procedure I would like to highlight is that the film works with a huge repertoire of references to the gospel narrative by using references from the history of Jesus, of art, of music, and of drama. Therefore, it can be seen also as a fundus of intermediate references in a reception and transmission process. This is an interesting case of staging the Passion of the Christ on the silver screen. By addressing this particular narrative, the film inserts itself into a particular stream of film production that covers the history of cinema from the very beginning until today. The first long feature film was a film about the Passion of the Christ. Let's contrast this art house production with something completely different, a commercial film. We find quotation of the life of Jesus also in other fields. And I would like to show you this new commercial to give you an idea of this kind of usage of the same narrative.
Great. Okay, everyone, thanks for coming in. Well, the latest numbers are in. It seems that stunts are performing very, very well for us. Research shows that we've not only increased awareness of the Jesus brand among urban Jews 25 to 35, but we're also getting great traction with our sub-brands like the Messiah, Christ, the Son of God. This was changing water into wine, healing the blind was here, and this was the feeding the multitude thing with the loaves and the fishes. And all this with no media buy whatsoever.
That's earned media.
So our recommendation, obviously, is to continue with more stunts. Over to you, creative.
Okay. So, we already know that water fits really well with your image. It's pure, it's natural, baptisms. So it makes sense to keep pushing in that direction. Now for your next stunt, we were thinking that you could walk on water. Walk on water. Sounds sketchy. I mean, I see how it could go socially. But I happen to know personally the guy who created water, and it is liquid, and you can drown in it, and you can die in it. Yes, but me not drowning would be a big plus for humanity. Look, if it's in terms of
Sorry guys, man. If you like this walking on water idea, we can make it happen.
One Productions. They've handled all our stunts.
even if you could get me walking on water, that's a big if. The Romans would never let us do that.
Not a problem. We take care of the entire stuff.
What about the unions?
They don't exist yet.
All right then. But if I die doing this, you better bring me back to life.
Actually, we can do that.
The question is how to frame this kind of analysis in a theoretical perspective. And I would like to offer the panorama of different theoretical approach we could combine. Firstly, theories of mediatization can be very helpful to understand how religion is staged by different media in a secular age. Steve Hayward and his colleagues have given an important input by introducing the concept of banner religion by addressing the circulation and diffusion of religious references in media. But why religious references are perceived in some kind as religious? How is it possible to relate them if they are not presented within the context of religious institution? If it's true that people do not know religion, how can it work? And so I would suggest to rely this idea of mediatization and banal religion to a second concept, which is the concept of cultural imaginary. And we define cultural imaginary as a constitutive, historical, anchored dimension of society. It encompasses a heterogeneous pool of mental and material images and products. It is related to expectations, representations, images, stories, ideas, and practices. The imaginary involves individuals and collectives in multifaceted ways, involving affects, emotion, and cognitive processes. The interactions with communicative practices are to be analyzed not only from the perspective of the diffusion, but above all from the perspective of a plurality of reception by involving human beings in their whole life. Therefore, we assume that religious narratives are strongly intertwined with society. They belong to a cultural fundus that is transmitted within interactions of different social fields. Of course, our religious institution an important place of transmission, but this is not exclusive. For instance, cinema was and is a very influential way in transmitting the narrative of the passion. And the third aspect, considering this theoretical construction, combining theories of mediatization and the concept of imaginary, has understanding the complexity of communication processes where religious references recur. We assume that for analyzing these processes, we not only have to look at religious representation and reception, but that the reception processes themselves are spaces of production of religious meaning. Therefore, the question is not how different social fields like arts or marketing perceive religion, rather, which meaning-making processes are going on and which kind of religious meaning are produced by means of references to core narratives and practices from religious traditions. So, if we try now very quickly to go from this theoretical reflection to methodology, I would point out that we assume that media transmission of religious representation is a multi-layered, complex field. The question is how to analyze it and which methods can we use. Is semiotic the answer? I am focusing on audiovisual sources where images play a central role. Therefore, methodology is inspired by different approaches from visual studies I combine together. Firstly, the approach to the image was formulated by Hans Belting in the context of the built anthropology, an anthropology of images. And secondly, the semiotic approach by Roger Audin, which is related to film, but generally to audiovisual communication. So to sum up very shortly and also oversimplifying, an image has three dimensions. There is the medium. This is the materiality of an image. In my case, we have to do with electronic inputs or audiovisual material. Then the image, understood in a narrow sense, this is the reference, the mental imagery we have in our mind or we share in a collective that allows us to understand that this is Jesus speaking with his disciple in some small house. And the third dimension is the body. And Belting speaks of the body referring to the body of the me image and the body of the reviewer. The body as a fundamental dimension in receiving images. So this third moment, the body, implies that we consider imaging or visual representation from the perspective of reception. The gaze is the moment where the viewer is connected with the image. And in the encounter between viewer and image, new meaning is produced. Receiving an image is therefore a practice where meanings are produced. It takes place in particular spaces of communication that may larger differ depending from the image and the viewer. The concept of space of communication itself is a theoretical construct. And Roger Audin defines this as a space within which the combination of constraints leads actants, transmitter and receiver to share the same experience. So I try to make it more clear with the scheme. We are speaking about visual representation, and we assume that it's maybe useful. It could be a good tool of working by starting thinking which kind of perception processes are going on. And we receive a certain medium, in this case is it a film, and then we ask which kind of references, which kind of mental images or socially shared images are important to produce meaning. And this encounter of medium and references through the reception constitute the representation. So I'm saying that the image is created in the reception process. And we never have one reception process. We have different going on in a parallel way, in contrasting way, or in ways that are complementary. We don't know. But I use this scheme really as a methodology to have some clear question about this very meaningful material of the Passion of Jesus in audiovisual sources. So let's go back to the image. How do I use it? And I will show it with a third video clip drawn from the same film, Jésus de Montréal. It's 1 minute.
Première point, c'est que je vais te dire en rouge.
Maybe just the context shortly. Daniel has a very strong character. He's identifying himself as Jesus, not only on stage, but generally in his life. And he has lots of conflict, his fights against consumerism, again, a certain way of seeing actors within casting. And so at the end, he has to go to court because he destroyed some electronic devices. And then he meets there in court a lawyer, and the lawyer invites him to his office for a dinner. And we see this scene with the lawyer.
Premier point, c'est que je vais te dire en rouge. Pourquoi maintenant, presque tous les clients, en fait, de votre mes amis, sont dans les milieux médiatiques, show business, littérature. Alors je fais les contrats, la planification fiscale, des investissements financiers. Dans certains cas, ça peut jusqu'au plan de carrière. C'est quoi sur un plan de carrière? C'est quelque chose que je fais disant avec quelqu'un qui est encore relativement jeune, mais qui ne sait pas juste comment exploiter son talent. Alors on s'assoit ensemble et on essaie de voir ce qu'il veut faire exactement. En fait, on essaie de définir ses rêves. Et ensuite, on établit les étapes pour les réaliser. Ça fonctionne? Je connais une actrice qui est là-bas, dans les quartiers ouvriers, qui habite maintenant à Malibu Beach. Je pourrais vous en nommer d'autres qui sont venus de Shawinigan, de Salomon-Port-Neuf, qui ont des hôtels particuliers, par exemple, ou des lofts à New York.
Bonjour Lisa, ça va? Ça va.
Pour tout ça, il faut faire quoi? Rien de spécial. Ce que vous aimez. Même je suis un gros sanctuaire. Jésus-Christ est un personnage tout à fait à la mode, mais il faudrait qu'en studio me connaître pour faire des émissions culturelles du week-end. Sauf l'exception, je peux les inviter, je pense. Là, je peux faire 2 fois au téléphone si vous voulez. Si je me dis mon kiki, il y a davantage d'espace média que de gens qui ont quelque chose à dire. J'ai pas grand-chose à dire moi-même, vous savez. C'est pas vraiment essentiel. Vous êtes un très bon acteur. Un acteur a besoin de texte. On pourrait vous écrire un canevas. Il y a une manière de dire des insignifiances qui est extrêmement populaire. Pensez à Ronald Reagan. Il y en a d'autres. Dans tous les pays, maintenant, les acteurs sont omniprésents. La télévision, la radio, les magazines. Il y a des acteurs. Partout.
Il y a des actrices aussi. Il y a Jane Fonda.
À condition qu'elles soient jolies. Mais ça ne devrait pas t'inquiéter jamais, mon cœur.
Oui, il est comme des fois.
Ah, I left a message for you. I'll call you back. Vous avez jamais pensé à publier des livres? Vous voulez dire un roman? Ouais. Ou un livre de souvenirs. Vos voyages ou votre rencontre à l'école. N'importe quoi. Je suis pas écrivain. Je suis pas dit écrire un livre, j'ai dit publier. Non, des écrivains, ça, les maisons d'édition en ont qui sont disponibles. Talentueux et pauvres. Évidemment, ce que je fais. Voilà. J'essaie juste de vous faire comprendre qu'avec le talent que vous avez, cette ville-là est à vous.
There are different possibilities to look at this particular clip or the entire film. And I've chosen three possibilities, three different spaces of communication. The first one is maybe social criticism. So we are seeing the film in the mode of social criticism, and to link the film with mental images, or we could reconstruct a repertoire of different usage of Jesus or the temptation motive within commercials. So we could link this particular scene with the commercial I've shown to you. Or another possibility, we could say we try to receive this film or to analyze this film in the mode of communication, of the space of communication of religious references in an emic perspective, for instance, of a Roman Catholic believer. And so the focus, the repertoire of references we could use could be the gospel, histories, and then the description of the temptation of Jesus by the devil, or the whole tradition in the history of art, the representation tradition of this particular scene from the Synoptic Gospel. So we have a different kind of repertoire of images we could use to reconstruct the representation the film is showing us if we read it in the modus of religion. And then we can say it's disturbing because its use is too strong, this actualization within an economic system of trying to produce star for our work, or it can be a radical reading from the Vedic wisdom. And the third possible reception we could look at over our own in a kind of hermeneutic reflection. The cinema and religious studies is also a kind of reception. So the fundus of images and the cultural imaginary we could reconstruct for this third space of communication would be, for instance, the reception of the narrative of the temptation in different media. This film plays a lot with the history of media, and so would be a possibility. But there are many others, and as I told you, this scheme is just a means to make some order in all questions we could ask if we deal with religion outside religious institution. And I think it's important also to consider that academic analysis itself is a space of communication. So it's very short, oversimplified, but 25 minutes so that we have a little bit of time for discussion, and I will point out some points just as a conclusion. Religious transmission processes are not relegated within religious institutions. This is the first conclusion I draw from this research project I'm doing. But if we accept this, it means that we open the field of religious studies in a very broad way, and then we must accept the complexity of communication processes, which is distinguished by a permanent production of meaning that transforms the science depending on the communication context. This implicates that several transmission processes are going on simultaneously that can be complementary or they can be conflicting with each other. Some interpretations of science are dominant, are subversive, some are transitory, and others long-lasting. Some transmission processes are reintegrated into religious institutions. For instance, if a community organizes a vision of Mel Gibson, The Passion of the Christ on a Good Friday, the artistic mediatic representation of Jesus is reintegrated in transmission processes within a community. Some are not. For instance, an extreme example could be if a film is received as blasphemous and banned. For instance, The Last Temptation of Christ by Scorsese or La Ricotta by Pierpaolo Pasolini. So this is more or less what I wanted to say, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Daria. We will meet the discussion in the end. Now I would like now to introduce our second speaker, Annette Bieke, who will present a paper about his courses on immediacy and mediation in classical and modern advaita Vedanta.
Well, my paper is about the Advaita Vedanta, the famous school of Veda hermeneutics, Uttara Mimamsa, introduced by the great Upanishad commentator Ajahn Shankara in the 7th century. He was the first to single out the Upanishads, the final part of the Veda, as the very end and consummation of the Veda in a spiritual sense, for they dealt with gnosis and not ritual. In Shankara's interpretation, the great teaching of the Upanishad was non-dual Advaita, oneness of self, universe, and Godhead, the all-pervading absolute spirit, and condensed in great sayings, Mahavakya, like Tattvamasi, that you are. Shankara's Advaita Vedanta suggested a very concise and also very integrative reading of the Upanishad, and was not easily bypassed already in pre-modern India. But it attained tremendous semiotic expansion in British India. In a highly entangled to which many voices contributed, German Romantic philosophers, Orientalists, philologists, theosophists, and also Indian intellectuals and reformers, the Advaita Vedanta was a major factor in the construction of the mystic East. One can speak of a global discourse which made it into the Vedanta, the Indian philosophy, despite of the existence of other Vedanta schools and other philosophy, and also in more or less popularized form, the prime definition of Hinduism, a summary term that itself had evolved only in the late 19th century. And also the peak of mysticism in India and beyond. In this it is this mysticism connection which is the starting point of my paper, as it is of particular interest for the conference theme, mediation and immediacy. The non-dual vision of Advaita Vedanta was not only the prime model of Eastern mysticism, from Rudolf Otto to Peter Berger, but also of unmediated mystical peak experience in modern mysticism debates. It is well known that such views of immediacy, for instance propounded by Aldous Huxley, were initially opposed by those who claimed mystical experience was always culturally and socially mediated, and immediacy a sheer illusion. This was the position of Katzenpenner. This paper explores the insiders' discourses, past and present, which present an alternative to this debate and claim instead complex dynamics of immediacy and mediation. The term mysticism, by the way, is not even used, very rarely used, even in modern Reform Vedanta, which otherwise makes ample use of rhetorics of immediacy. The first part of my paper will be about classical Advaita Vedanta, where we find the most extensive reflections on immediacy and mediation, including rational arguments for the interconnectedness of immediacy and ineffability, both terms in European history of mysticism, very important terms, and often related to supposed irrationality or transrationality. And here, Advaita Vedanta is very try to be very rational. The second part will address the semiotic transformations produced by transition from elite circles of Veda hermeneutics, learned Brahmin scholars, Orthodox monks, and contemplated to a public, large urban audience in post-colonial India and beyond. A short final section supplements the Emic views by Etic theories of mediation and transcendence and brings the insiders and outsiders' views into a dialogue. Maybe only very shortly about the major premises of classical Advaita Vedanta. The absolute reality is Brahman, the Brahman of the canonical Upanishads. Brahman is defined as pure existence, consciousness, infinity, and bliss, Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma, or Satchidananda. This very nature is viewed as the laws of the universe, of all what exists. Brahman is the all-pervading soul, the self of the universe, and the core of the human being. The Advaita, who is the major referent of the term Atma, the human being, the soul. The Advaitins understand the Atman as trans-individual. Indeed, already the Upanishads treat Atman and Brahman often interchangeably. This universe is nothing but Brahman, or they also say everything is Atman alone. All these are but expressions of the Atman. What is now quite interesting is that we have also in the Upanishad again and again heavy apophatism, or they speak, the verses speak about ineffability, which seems to imply that no means of mediation exists. They repeatedly state that the ultimate reality is completely ineffable, Brahman beyond sound, touch, that the mind cannot comprehend it, words cannot reach it, and so on. And yet it is also said, the knower of Brahman becomes Brahman. It is such statements, along with the Mahavakyas, that you are, or other Mahavakya, Aham Brahma Asmi, I am Brahman, or Prajnana Brahman, knowledge is Brahman, which form the basic material for the Vedantic core doctrine of strict non-duality, absolute identity between the ultimate reality, the all-pervading spirit, and human soul or self. Shankara and the later school devote a lot of hermeneutic effort and analytical reflection to this claim, to make it rationally lucid. And a major backbone is a theory of immediacy. A rational epistemology of immediacy, which is based on an analytical investigation into the nature of consciousness, which is, the final conclusion is, it's transcendental consciousness, which is self-evident, svata prakasha, self-luminous, and self-shining. I'm coming back to this argument. While such arguments support mystical immediacy, classical Advaita Vedanta also holds immediacy to be grounded in mediations. In fact, the thesis is there is no immediate experience without these mediations. And this is Shabda Pramana. The Veda, the Vedic revelation, is seen as a verbal means of knowledge. This is true for all Mimamsa schools. They say the word itself has salvative power. It tells something which you otherwise would not know. And because the word of the revelation is giving so much emphasis, these Mimamsa schools, also the ritual Mimamsakas, they developed very interesting and very deep theories of language. And these Uttara Mimamsas, the Advaita Vedantins, have a theory of indication. They say we cannot understand, we will see that also a bit more closer, we cannot go to the primary sense of the word, of the words when we have Mahavakyas, Tattvam Asi, that you are. We have to go, words can also have a secondary function, secondary indicative, indexical function. And if we look at these teachings of the Upanishads like that, we come to a different meaning than the primary one. And finally, it's not enough just to read the text. Anyhow, in India, this is my big book, it's about that in India, silent reading, maybe it's only a very modern thing. Texts were always memorized, recited, dramatized, and very important also orated, and the oral teaching from teacher to disciple. So with this theory, and that's why the necessity of the guru. And there is a lot of discussion also in the tracts which are not so famous, not in the original commentaries, but there are a lot of tracts of Advaita Vedanta which spend a lot of time, also Upadesha Sahasri, which is attributed to Shankara, what are the qualities of the disciple and what are the qualities of the teacher. And already in the Mundaka Upanishad it is said the guru must be both. He must be a well-versed scholar. Shrotya, he has heard a lot of Upanishad, and he must be Brahmanishta. Sorry, I have made a mistake, there should be an H. He must be firmly rooted in the knowledge he is teaching. So with these 1 and 2, the Advaita Vedantins developed an interesting theory of communicating the non-verbal, a linguistic theory of indication or secondary signification. Before I go, I can go to the next picture. I stay one moment because I have Akanda Akara Vritti I have not explained yet. I do it in 1 minute. For our topic, it is of special interest that all Advaita Vedanta sources speak of immediacy. All the Upanishads as well as the commentaries and treatises. They talk invariably of direct, immediate knowledge, sakshat aparoksha jnana, and also, but less frequently, of direct experience, aparoksha anubhuti. The same Upanishad, the Brahataranyaka, which tells neti, not this, not that, has in the next chapter, it says, explain, it's a dialogue between student and teacher, explain to me the Brahman that is immediate and direct, Sakshat, Aparoksha, Brahman. The self within all. And the teacher says, this is yourself, which is within all. You see here, it's quite interesting, the Brahman, which is said to be ineffable, is at the same time stated to be known very directly and to have to do with one's own self. And also very important that oral teaching things, the Advaita Vedanta in the original context is not a philosophy or some grey abstract mysticism like Otto said, but it's a living teaching tradition with a certain, and a teaching method actually. With radical consequences, radical transformative effects according to the treatises. Well, the person who really understands is a Jivan Mukta, free while living here and now, having reached a state of perfection which is consumed in infinite viditude, whatever happens. You know, even when problems are there or the body suffers, but that person is said to be always in inner peace and have a blissful state. And it's not a fleeting state, but a constant one. So this is the promise, and we will later see that there are autobiographical scratches, which are exactly like that. Shankara calls this person a disembodied, bodiless knowledge, a disembodied being on earth. And we will see it's a shift of identification, I want to say. I want to explain it later. So this is the main scene of immediacy and mediation, which is built on several opposites and which are solved by certain things, by certain statements. We have this extreme apophatism, not reached by the mind, but on the other hand, a rational epistemology of immediacy, speaking about the self-luminosity of consciousness and the ineffability of the human soul itself. Shankara is very much aware that words cannot reach the self, which the Upanishads talk about. He says, those who see that the self-Atman is only one, free from suffering and never changing, must also accept prima facie, that there is no word for it and that ultimately it cannot be known. But this ineffability argument is not the major thing. He says even that native formula is only there to show us the true nature of the self, which is ineffable. That transcendental consciousness cannot be defined by qualities, by activity, and it's not it can never be objectified, but it is the basis of all thoughts. Yeah, this and this self-luminosity is there because everybody of us can say I am, but in fact we can never say I am not. I mean, the person who says I'm not is. And this is a very major argument that this consciousness is never, it cannot be negated. Everything what can be negated is not the real self. So the self can also not be reached by thoughts and feelings because they can be objectified. And there are several, they call it nyaya, and there are several methods to arrive at this true nature of the I. For instance, Anvayatireka method, that means the method to think about what is going through and what can be negated and what cannot be negated. And this method is applied to the three states: waking, dream, and deep sleep. Yes, we know I have slept. And when we have dreamless sleep, even when we have dreamless sleep, we even say, I have slept well, I feel well relaxed and so on. And this is for the Advaita Vedantins a very important sign that not only consciousness belongs to the self or the soul, but also bliss inherently to its inherent nature. It's quite interesting, this argument about immediacy, because they pretend this pure I am, which is knowledge consciousness bliss, which is existence consciousness bliss. It is the only immediate thing which can be known. Every other knowledge we have is paroksha jnana, not immediate, not direct. The mind, the thoughts are a mere reflection of the eternal self, of the eternal consciousness. So I'm coming to the next part, extreme language criticism and the doctrine of verbal knowledge and a linguistic theory, Lakshana indication. This is also quite interesting. They developed much of it also after Shankara. For instance, in Sadananda's Vedanta Sara, it is that Mahavakya, Tattvam Asi, that you are. It's that they pondered about each of the words. And they say each of the three words have to be there. And because each of the three words are there, because Tat and Tvam, you and that, are put together in the sentence with the copular are, you are, the isness, it cannot mean you, I, cannot mean the limited individual, the limited mind, the limited body. It must mean some different you. And the Tvam cannot mean the omniscient Lord. The Advaita Vedanta accepts Ikshvara or Saguna Brahman, the Saguna Brahman creating the world, but that can also not be the meaning that oneness can happen. So what is the real significance of I? What is the real significance of Brahman? Of I, we come back to the self-luminosity of consciousness and also the Tatvada, the Brahman, is inquired, and the only definition which is accepted is Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma, that existence, knowledge, limitlessness. And it says it is an indexical definition, a Lakshana Vadya, because all the three words have to be there, that we understand knowledge is not known knowledge, with the knower-known difference. It's limitless knowledge. So it cannot be an activity like our normal knowledge. So, Satya must be there, existence. It's always, existence cannot be an inert thing, because jnana, knowledge is there. And so there are long commentaries on this passage of the Taittiriya Upanishad. So it's quite interesting. Now I'm coming to that. I'll only show you the Sanskrit term Akhanda Akara Vritti, unbroken, limitless thought form. So there is immediate non-dual experience, but there are also indispensable mediators, starting with the Veda word, the living word of the Guru, and also a certain state of mind. This was developed also past Shankara. The original argument of Shankara was the light of consciousness is like a lamp which lights up everything and also itself. But the later tradition accepted it somehow that some thought modification must be there to grasp this knowledge, and they were speaking of Akhanda Akara Vritti, limitless, unbroken thought form, which is yet different, a different operation of thinking than all our other thoughts, because in all our other thoughts, two operations are working. Attention for the object, and this is, they call it vritti vyapti, and then phala vyapti, this is that, this is this, yeah? And they say in this special knowledge, actually we don't need a second operation, or, or they fall into one. Well, this is now the modern reform. My question was now, what happens to this very scholastic method of looking at immediate knowledge when the Advaita Vedanta left these elite circles and became public? And of course, not only the three mediations are there, but also knowledge of Sanskrit, Brahman birth, male, and all that falls down in the modern democratization of Advaita Vedanta. So my suggestion, or as far as I can see, as I looked at the text, well, one thing remains: Guru as absolute authority and as icon of immediate experience, which he owes himself and which he can miraculously pass on. The second thing is that immediacy became highly personalized in autobiographies and sketches by disciples and admirers. This includes the devotees' own experiences, which are often represented as extraordinary, spectacular, and miraculous. And none of these modern Advaita Vedanta masters who became internationally known had actually a traditional training. And my fourth point is when the Advaita Vedanta went public, there was not only this concentration on the teacher, but also an expansion of media and mass outreach. And finally, despite of this, these two dimensions are there, but finally the teacher, guru or enlightened master remains the most essential, as he is both media and message merged in his person into one, and he is the most powerful sensational force in Advaita Vedanta. And now I actually, for all these thesis, I have a lot of examples. I mean, you see how much here in what Vivekananda says, this was the major message of Ramakrishna: do not depend on doctrines. They are little compared with the essence of existence in man. And he speaks of the great teachers of mankind as the real powers of light. And you see how much there is concentration here on the person and on individual experience. And here, I think this is also quite interesting. Vivekananda's conversion story. It is not by teaching, but by touch, and by physical touch of his Guru Ramakrishna. That strange touch immediately caused a complete revolution in my mind. Wherever I looked, I saw Brahman and Brahman alone. I lived in that consciousness the whole day. Since then, I have never doubted the truth of non-dualism. And you see here how the teacher can miraculously change the disciple. Quite similar, this happened also to Paul Brunton when he met Ramana Maharshi. He met him twice. In his book, he writes twice, and he says as soon as the saint was in trance when he came to him, and all of a sudden he felt in him a great peace and quietude. I know only that a steady river of quietness seems to be flowing near me, that a great peace is penetrating the inner reaches of my being. And it's even more topped in his second meeting. I find myself outside the ring of the world of consciousness. Everything has disappeared in the midst of an ocean of blazing light. I feel rather that thing, and my heart is remolded in rapture. What I find interesting here, that Brunton speaks of the mind-blowing state where no more thoughts are there, and he's constantly reflecting, at least in his, in his memory, what he writes down, he's constantly reflecting what happened to him, and he is using well-known tropes from European mysticism, like the blazing light, the rapture, and feel rather than think. Just compare it with the saying from Swami Tapovan, who was a great ascetic who never left the Himalayas, what he says about this experience. This is now more a translation what we find in the Advaita Vedanta treatises. Whether it is on the peaks of the Himalayas, on Mount Kailash, I find the same perfect being, the same self-luminous thing at all places, at all times, in all states. I hear nothing else, touch nothing else, taste nothing else, and so on. I do not find any other joy than in that bliss. And also it's very much as this inner state of bliss, it's constantly with him. It's a shame I would have had very interesting further readings of Shivananda and Chinmayananda. Maybe I'm going now, this is Shivananda practical, I mean, all these teachers have a different approach also. When the Advaita Vedanta became democratized, it became also pluralized. That's another thesis of mine. But I'm going to the end, and this media, and also the disciples, what they say about. It's a shame that I have no time of this. Today you can also see the Upanishads in a TV serial. It was broadcasted in 2012 to 13, and now it is available on DVD and YouTube. And it's really nice. It's very interesting. I have at the university, I have an introduction to Hinduism along with TV. It's really very interesting. And and the last episode, I think that is very typical in this TV serial, which was issued by the Chinmaya Mission, by the present international head of the Chinmaya Mission. It's gratitude to the teacher, and it's not the story of Shankara himself. Yeah, Shankara is the standing person, but of his disciple Giri, this later Totaka Acharya, who becomes a great Advaita teacher and a great poet by his service to the teacher and his love for the teacher and by the grace of his guru, by the mental power of his guru. So I think this is quite typical for modern transformation. So I don't know, do I have no? Yeah. Yes, it's not, both are not semiotic theories, but both are interesting theories for my material, which I presented. Birgit Meyer's thesis on mediation and immediacy, and Hubert Knoblauch's communication theory of transcendence and anthropological theory of transcendence. According to Birgit Meyer, we have there is no immediate experience, but all immediacy is mediated by, according to her, sensory forms. Yeah, that's why she finds it very important to study sensory forms. And I found this theory quite interesting. It partly really fits even to the classical Advaita Vedanta, who says we need the words of the Shruti and we need the teacher and we need this and that. But I find it also important to say, in one place, this theory of religion as a practice of mediation doesn't capture the Advaita Vedanta tradition. It cannot capture this pure I am. And this theory could be better captured by Hubert Knoblauch. The constructivist position must assume that the culturally constructed symbol worlds are founded on subjective, it just goes the other way around, on subjective experiences of other realities, which are the starting point, but which become only religious when they are communicated and embedded in a larger religious universe. And so we can say, yeah, maybe everybody knows, or I am, but the interpretation is cultural, of course, that this I am should be at the same time the basis of the universe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annette. Our next speaker is Vincenzo Pace, who will present a paper entitled The Art of Buddha, Leaving Monasteries, Fighting the Enemy.
Well, my presentation deals with Buddhism, modern Buddhism, more precisely, some Buddhist movement. Okay, the general framework of my research is the past was fundamentalism. And the problem for me is to what extent it's possible to apply this notion arose in the Protestant environment to a system of belief we usually call Buddhism, but it's a problem to classify Buddhism. under this label. Secondly, I would like to explore this project, the relationship between religious movement that is able to manage sacred text, political mobilization, and violence. It is the case I will try to illustrate shortly in this presentation. The paper deals with this new Sinhala Buddhist movement called Bodhi Balasena. It's acronyms, you can translate Buddhist Power Force. It's clear, Buddhist Power Force. Founded in Sri Lanka in 2012 by two monks. 3 years after the end of the civil war, thus as told of Sinhalese state apart. It's a dramatic civil war with many victims and so on. And of course, the war was between the Sinhalese government and its minority, Tamil minority, since the defeat of the Tiger Tamil army in 2009, this movement, Bodhi Balasena, changed the target. And the new target is Muslim, is Islam. This is the homepage of PBS. I'm working on this strategy of communication in the new media. I can just comment. There's a strategy of colors, because these colors refer to the national color of the Sri Lanka. It means the flag of Sri Lanka as this color, but with new color that stress the difference between the Buddhism, Sinhalese Buddhism, and Islam. The focus, the theoretical focus of the paper is the social construction of the image of the enemy. Three elements of the narrative, religious narrative. First of all, this movement is trying to identify a text par excellence from among the large corpus of texts of Buddhist school of Theravada in Pali, in language Pali, electing it as the sacred text to be regarded also as the source of inherent narrative of the history of Sinhala Buddhism. In this sense, this first element converts with the idea I have explored in many other case studies of fundamentalist movement, of this identification of the sacred text in order to explain what's the perfect model of society, what's the social order to be imposed to a society, in spite of some plurality, some difference and so on. Secondly, mobilize symbols, signs, and rituals pertaining to the monastic tradition, Sangha, as moral resources for a collective action in political and social sphere. Identified for the other, first of all was the Tamil, now it's Muslim. I expect the next one is Christians, evangelical churches and so on, as a potential threat, a dangerous sources of contamination and corruption of the moral virtues of Buddhism, considered as the foundations of the social bond, social capital bond, the legitimacy of political power, the ultimate source of the organic solidarity of the nation. This movement has is quite normal in the story of the sacred text in the Sinhalese Theravada school, they selected this text. It's very famous, the Mahamsa. It's the Great Chronicle in Pali. It's the book tells the story of the kings of the island since 6 centuries and Dominic after 14th century. It's very large history. This book is, of course, is a sort of, this is the first English translation in 1878. It's a classical epic poem of the Sinhalese king. But this movement, along with other movements, more moderate, transformed this epic poem into source of the collective memory, both religious, in religious terms, but also in political terms, nationalist terms. In this sense, the idea I have used by these monks, which founded this movement, is they try to draw from this sacred text the link between religion, language, and land. In the land blessed by Buddha, the sacred text Mahamsa was the first exercise in the elaboration of the Sinhala language conducted by the monks. It's quite similar in other religions. Look at Islam. This strong relation between the creation of language and the sacred text. I don't know if you remember very interesting speech. One of the last speech by Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian leader, just in front of the Kosovo, just in front of the Serbian minority. He said, we have to defend this land because this land was evangelized by two saints and they created our language. This is my framework. In this sense, the narrative is the island of Sri Lanka is regarded as Dhammadipa, the island of Dharma, and the monks are the guardians of the sacred territorial boundaries and moral unity of his people. So, if I assume the idea of religion as communication or communicative action, for me it's interesting to analyze the reinvention by monks of a repertoire of symbols and signs belonging to Theravada Sinhala Buddhism by a new, well-educated generation of Buddhist monks in Sri Lanka with a view to reasserting the centrality of the monk's sacred mediation in the nation-building process. The leaders of the movement are successful outsourcing religious rituals from the monastic community Sangha to the public squares in revolt. This is the hermeneutical circle of the BBC ideology. They started from the selection of a sort of among a corpus of various texts. They selected a non-canonical text, transformed this non-canonical text in a sacred text. Secondly, the sacred text has been assumed as the model of the social order and political national identity, and in this sense, reaffirming the supremacy of the authority of monk in religious and political terms. If I try to many times come back to some very seminal article by Talmaya, particularly when he spoke in 1992 about the fetishization of Buddhism. According to this scholar and other scholars, like De Silva, Bartolomeus, Semiotic, and so on, this term describes the transformation of a system of belief called Buddhism with open boundaries, the Buddha Dharma, into a closed one. This concept of Buddhism means that it's very similar to the process occur in other religions, process of biblification, the process of scripturalism, to emphasize the letter, not the spirit, and so on. And the monk in this process, in this path, became a specialist in the sacred, who mobilized for interpretation of some of the texts belonging to a non-canonical Theravada tradition, coming up with a religion cum nationalist ideology. It's a sort of national religious movement, like some ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel. There are many groups, religious and national movement. In this sense, in post-colonial state, according to Tambaya, there was a sort of dramatic confrontation underway between two kinds of Buddhism. One compassionate, according to the tradition, and ethically oriented toward universal values. The other with a dark, I'm quoting a sentence by Tambaya, a dark and potentially violent side that betrays the former's goals. The religious violence expressed by a group of monks in Sri Lanka, and more recently, equally, more radically by the BBS, represents as sociological consequences of the political reification or biblification of the Buddha Dharma. The founder of this process in the past was a monk, Anagarika Dharmapala, who founded this, he came up with this idea of Buddhism modernism. What does mean this formula? It means precisely the idea transform the traditional religious function of monks into caretakers and social workers. It used precisely this expression: transform monks in social workers. In the sense, he invited to go out from the Sangha and to spread the virtues of Buddhism in the social society. Like the Christian priest ministering to his flock, Dharmapala, mimetic reconstruction of monk, modeled on the Christian priest, was intentional. It's interesting, this mimetic process of contamination of the settlement, religious of the settlement to the local system of belief. Of course, this mimetic process has a very important impact on the nation-building process, because the political elite assumed this religious model came up by Dharmapala and then the descendant of Rama, the disciple of Rama, like the political resource in order to create the national identity, the national consciousness. The most relevant effect of the Sinhala on the police was a sort of mirror syndrome, because the non-Sinhala minorities, then I show you some very short figure, the non-Sinhala minorities particularly the Tamil and Muslim, began to shape their own ideas of what it meant to be Tamil or Muslim, living in a predominantly Sinhala area, and they started rethinking their own identity. This is the figure about the diversity. Okay, this kind of estimation from demographic point of view, you have to pay attention. It's a sort of shortcut in order to have a first idea, but looking at this figure deeply, we discover a variety within each diversity. This is more evident because, of course, the civil war was in this area where the Tamil population was concentrated since the British settlement in order to exploit the tea plantation in this area. The British rule decided to second a migration from the south of India, and they arrived and then stay in this area. And this area was the theater of the tremendous, dramatic civil war. Okay, in this sense, I'm studying this strategy of communication implemented by this movement, particularly when they try to transform rituals into public performance, forging representation in which people are used. In this sense, it illustrates the above consideration. Analyze first the main content, image, slogan, text produced by this movement in a very modern, hyper-modern way through new media and so on. And my intent is to show how the BBS communicates using a repertoire of sign message drawn from the symbolic character of books. Just to focus, because my time is right at hand, since the beginning of the first appearance of this movement, both in the public sphere and in the digital relation, they started with this a strong campaign against halal, against Muslim. If you look at the homepage, this predominant message against halal is presented in first of all with a game between colors. Positive colors refer to the flag of nation and the symbols of this movement, and the black, permanently black, like that. Of course, is prohibited, but black is continually referred. This is another example. In this very, I have no time to explain. It's about takia. Do you know takia is a practice among some Shia groups in order to dissimulate their Muslim identity. It's not diffused in Sunna area, but in this case, if you have time, but it's a classical example. Now Muslims are a little group. When we become an important group, they will start to claim more power. Okay. Second element, on this website of the PBS, There's an interesting repetition of gesture and expression, the image that transmits some very clear message. In particular, I was struck by this repetition of the raised index fingers that reinforce the facial expression of those sternly point out to caution against and stigmatize enemy Islam. Just to give you an example, look at this is the General Secretary. In this first image, is commenting Quran, not Muhammad. It's commenting Quran in order to explain that Muslims are violent, cruel, and so on. This is a confrontation with an imam in an important place in the south. This is a public manifestation. This is a message, the contrast between Buddhist and others. So, I would like to comment, in order to finish my presentation, this image that appeared in March 2013 after a storm raid against halal butchers in a village not very far from Colombo. The message was interesting. The message was, okay, we are not vegetarian in principle. It's not compulsory duty to be vegetarian, but the way by which Muslims treat the animals is an evident demonstration of their cruelty and their how to say, the face of the enemy, the face of the devil. The sense they transform all these manifestations sort of eschatological struggles. Okay. The movement's leader and leader mobilize symbolic resources, draw from Buddhist tradition. And the riots and march they organize are the product of a sort of overcoding, according to Umberto Eco, a secondary political message carried within a message generated by a functional interpretation of primary base code. This sense is interesting to study. To conclude, the immediacy of the political struggle becomes an effective tool used by the BBS to claim that the policy as a soul must embody the eternal virtues of Buddha, defend the sacred confines of the island of Dharma, and ensure the social bond and Sri Lankan national identity in particular. All those who do not share this ideology pose a threat. They are seen as dangerous polluters of the purity of Sinhala Buddhism. This is not important. Okay, the BBS movement is, in order to explain what does mean for this radical movement, the emphasis on the island of Dharma. According to Sri Lankan Buddhist tradition, when Buddha died, his body was cremated, but his left canine Sri Dalada Maligawa was retrieved from the funeral pyre by his disciple Kerma, and after countless setbacks, the relic was carried to Sri Lanka in the 14th century by a princess who did it in her hair. He was able to transport this relic. To consider a symbol of the living Buddha, and at the same time the sign of a sacred land blessed by Buddha, the island of Dharma. In this sense, there's a reinterpretation of this relic. These are big, shining candies, very popular. They try this movement. They try to reinterpret this traditional relic in a political symbol of the purity of Islam, of Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vincenzo. I will invite Daria and Ellen to join us. So Patrick has the first question.
I have a question, or actually two questions, comments for Daria. About this issue of mediatization of religion in Java's theory of that, which you use kind of as a starting point. And the films would be, the films about the temptation of Christ would be examples of that in Java's terms, but I'm just skeptical about this as a comparative concept, because on the one hand, of course, media and religion are always intertwined, therefore the idea of mediatization of religion needs to be qualified. And also, it's just a phenomenon of the modern world, mostly post-Christian societies in Europe. For example, the Upanishad DVDs that we showed are not an example of the dawn, that there's an extraneous institution of media that is taking over and reworking religion. Right? So I was wondering what you would say about that, because you're proposing a general theory of the diffusion of religious images in culture, and then following on that, I was surprised that you didn't address the issue of visual culture when you talk about the diffusion of images, comparatively speaking, how they've been received. We know, of course, that historically, from place to place, there are very different notions on ideologies of what images are, and what the relationship to images and viewer is, and often these are relatively grounded. So, for example, Hindu notions of darshan have very little to do with the kind of images that you showed us, for example. So I was wondering how that would fit in your in a broader sense.
I've just tried to outline some points, and of course the whole issue of visual culture is the core element on this discussion, but it's not so problematic, so I didn't mention it. And maybe a small hint in my speech was behind the category of the gaze. That an image is not constituted just by its materiality or the references, but the gaze is if we analyze an image, we have to look at both the culture, visual culture, and the image itself. And it's alone doesn't say anything. But I wanted just to say, for me, the important part of mediatization theories is that somebody has recognized that something is going on. Because the state of the art was how religion uses meaning, which is okay, it's very important field of research, but I'm interested in another aspect, how all the system uses religion, and usually after papers people told me it's not religion, it had nothing to do with religion. And I think the idea of mediatization, I'm not satisfied with ban of religion. And he writes that it's not a call, it's not there are two comments, but of course it. And I think it's more complicated. And what's striking for me is there are different kinds of mediatization. Some are important, some are not. Sometimes we have debates and conflicts, like the whole issue about blasphemy in the last years. Sometimes we just say it's art. And I'm looking for a methodology to understand these differences. But I'm not working on a global level, I'm just looking at European culture. Which is also a little bit difficult, because if you look at all your visual media, and particularly feature film, it's a global industry, and even in the film was promoted as a reaction to Jesus' films, which is very interesting. So It's quite different. But my main focus on the repertoire of images I'm looking at are mainly European. So the answer, it's important to have the concept of mediatization. There are different of them. I didn't go into a deeper analysis, but the state of the art at the moment is not satisfying for this particular perspective in looking. The question is just what if we. I think the main problem comes from the concept of secularization. What is secularization? If you say yes, there's a secular world where religion is not anymore important, then you need the mediatization theory a la banal religion. But the question I'm addressing is maybe the problem is that religious traditions are going on, but not only in institutions. And the complexity is quite huge, and you open the definition of religion so much that at the end I understand the critique that everybody say we are speaking about everything and not at all what is religion. And we try to find a definition of religion, definition of media that allow to grasp a little bit this complexity. And not to say, because it's not satisfactory to say if it's too complex we cannot work with it. And my argument would be, because it is complex, we have to work with it, but we need different tools.
Yeah, but I mean, the circulation of religious institutions, the discourse outside religious institutions is going on everywhere. I mean, but it's only under very specific conditions in post-Christian Europe that we talk about mediatization. Nothing. The darshan paradigm, so the culture, has been a stock theme in Indian popular film, right? I mean, right? And that's not really what there's no evidence of secularization in whatever concept mediatization, I would say. But thanks.
Richard?
Yes, thank you. It's so happy there to follow up as well from your approach. Thinking about your methodology, ways in which you're thinking about generally to the image and emphasize, of course, this notion of reception and beginnings, culturation as a way of understanding the reception of the image. But I was curious if you were also shifting your thoughts as well to the production of the image, and in particular, distinguishing different kinds of images. And what I have in mind here is the ontology of the image. Have you given thought to when you speak of the possibility of any religious image, or in a post-secular sense, an over-determined spiritual image? Are you open to the possibility that, as in, let's say, the history of iconoclasm, different kinds of images are thought to have different depths or different capacity for an ontological conception of the presence, like you introduce that notion in this context. Do you think of it that way as well?
Yes. It's not possible to me to make a general theory about culture or images. I'm very pragmatic way working with the representation of the Christ in cinema, in commercials, audiovisual material. But maybe some insights from this particular field can be generalized and adapted to all the field of research. I've stressed today the reception because my point was to say we have science on different levels. But I would say that the meaning of representation is not a representation, it's in the play between representation and reception, in the fact that a viewer see an image and relate it with mental images or cultural shared images. So I was just thinking about this argument. But this process takes place also by production. Because in religious systems, to realize a reference from the perspective of production, you are embedded in the reception. But maybe on the level of production, there are other questions that are interesting. Which kind of materiality would you choose for your image, and why, which size, which place? So the question of production is, of course, very important. But I would be careful by completely separating reception from production, because I think even production is a certain form of reception by the fact that the visual communication, the gaze, is important even in production. And of course, in religious systems, there are moments of production of images where materiality do not play any role. So you have images that you imagine in your mind or in your practice, and they do not exist. So the point you are making is which is the relationship between references and the material image. In the language of values, the question about medium and image. And I would say religion is possible to have images where there is no materiality. So the pure imagination. And if you think about pure imagination in a visual culture, very clever, because you lose any kind of materiality. But you can have a discourse about this could be a kind of maybe possibility to describe also unconscious. Because animalism is not about the non-existence of images. Animalism is about the non-existence of the materiality. But there are also different cases. You have also images that can be seen only through the materiality. If you are in Turin, the shrine was visible through photography. Without photography, it was not possible to see what is depicted on this material and this fabric. And this would be kind of contradictory. But maybe the main point for me to sum up is interesting to think about this theoretical approaches to the images, like the difference between the references and the medium, because it sharp your attention for visual phenomena. But it's not my intention to make a general discourse. My intention was to keep it. And so it was of course sure over, but please do not understand as nothing to make a general theory. It's more nothing to communicate to you some insight on this particular point. Fatima?
Yes, the question is for Professor Watson. Jean-Claude can produce an interesting semiotic analysis of ideological discourses. He said that in order to produce an ideology, you have first to construct a narrative, which is the alpha and omega, beginning and end, and then a series of transformations, usually from an alternate positive, euphoric, to bedtime, present bedtime, historic, and then a future return of evolving things. Second, you have to construct the enemy, and you showed very well the contrastive play between subject and anti-subject, the enemy. But third one, he says that you also have to dispossess the enunciator from his speech. So to disengage the speaker from what he said, putting the discourse as an absolute word, as an absolute word, as an absolute proof, somehow disengaging the actual speakers from the discourse. Say, for example, it's done. It's not me that I'm saying this, it's the Buddha. So my question is, how do they manage to validate this discourse by means of the Buddhist canon? How do they find to validate the hate violence from Buddhist sources?
No, but of course there's a classical process that concern the nation building construction. just at the beginning of the national building process in Sri Lanka, was clear the alliance between the political and stratum of monks. They became a sort of the organic intellectuals of the new political nationalistic regime. In this sense, the convergence of interest between this political elite and religious elite was around to construct a line of collective memory, shared collective memory, of course, excluding minorities. Because, of course, I could understand the problem concerning Tamil, but when we look at the story of Islam, the Moors in this island, Islam arrived in the 7th century with Arab plates. And of course, when Portuguese settlers arrived in 16th century, they tried to marginalize Muslims because they were the competitors in the market in the ocean, Indian Ocean. And of course, they belong to the history of the nation. But because of this mythopoietic discourse, okay, to purify our mythical origin, we are the construction of the image of the enemy is a functional tool in order to mobilize people with a reinvention of signs, symbols, and rituals pertain to Theravada traditions, very important schools. I don't know why, just an example, why two monks wrote the sort of anthem for the holy war against time. This is a real problem in order to understand. There are some similar movement in Myanmar against the Rohingya minority, violently expulsed from the territory. In some aspect, we are the same problem with Theravada school. Perhaps there's some seminal element in Theravada school because of this idea that in Theravada school, okay, the path to Nirvana is a very difficult path, only for the entire people and so on, perhaps. But I don't have any other explanation. I'm interested more pragmatically in this construction of a myth around land, language, sacred text, and religion.
Yeah, I've got an observation and a question for that. In terms of the observation, it struck me that all three of the papers are talking about a movement of religion into new territory that we wouldn't necessarily expect to see it in. The movement into the political sphere in Sri Lanka, the movement into film and advertising, and the movement from classical into modern, which left me thinking about the mediators in each case. I mean, the human mediator. And so you were talking about the monks, and you just made a helpful addition to what I was thinking about when you talked about them becoming organic intellectuals linked to the new regime. I mean, that seems like a piece of the difference about them that is mobilizing them in this new direction. And with your story, I was stepping back to think about the mediators of, I mean, you're talking about filmmakers and advertisers as the people who are creating the stuff that you're then analyzing. And so it was striking me that I found that to think about who these people were and what role they're playing, what kind of self-understanding they have. But, so to Annette, in my more specific question, you seem to be identifying gurus as a key part of the mediation process in both classical and the modern Hinduism. But in the classical context, you were saying that when you talked about the immediate non-dual experience, you also said it has indispensable mediators, which I found interestingly paradoxical. And then you talked, as I wrote my notes, data as the word, the living world, and the guru's certain state of mind. And then when you talked about the gurus in the modern world, you talked about autobiographies. And I'm wondering if you could be more precise, give us a little more detail about that. I mean, what exactly has changed? Are they not studying text in the same way in the modern situation? Is ritual falling away? What all is changing in terms of the role that the guru is playing in terms of transmitting some kind of experience or understanding of experience or
Yes, thank you. Yeah, there's not much ritual in Advaita Vedanta. The main practice is only listening.
Listening to
how the guru explains the commentaries and the sources. So it's only listening. The guru must know a certain method, the teaching method, how to do that. And I mean, it's mostly post-Shankara that they develop 3 ways of practice. This is listening, shravana, manana, reflecting. Self-reflection is also very important, and nididhyasana, contemplating, meditating about what you have heard. But already Shankara says in his Brahma Sutra commentary, meditation does not give you new insights. You have already to have an input that something happens for you, that the knowledge deepens with you in meditation. And this is one of the differences in modern times, that many modern disciples expect from the teacher some miracle to happen from meditation. Yeah, I had not time to show everything. This is one difference. Another difference, I'm not sure, 100% sure, because one cannot do fieldwork studies in the past, unfortunately. It seems to me that guru veneration has increased. At least I could have, in that Chinmaya mission, I see that, yeah, and it seems to me that the individualization, the question, who am I, which was a question by Ramana Maharshi, and Chinmayananda spoke of subjective science, or the science of self-cultivation. So very much individual based. Even Dayananda, who teaches very traditional, even he translates Brahma Vidya, he translates as knowledge of the unlimited self, something like that. Yeah, you know, not even with Brahman, but everybody has this focus. It is not like that it's not there at all in the past, but it increased much in modern times. It seemed to me. As far, I mean, I'm only in the beginning also of asking these kind of questions. I would have to read more, but these are the 3 things that very much focus on personal experience, and yeah, and I had more examples like that also, that the disciples expect something miraculous of the guru and of the kind of meditation. And this is what Dayananda, therefore, he doesn't want to do so. He says, I'm a traditional teacher, but he has to say that shows that he thinks all others, or most others are not traditional, and he would make fun of teachers and students who think in the wide field of meditation, some lights and some whatnot pops up all of a sudden. And for him, I think this is very traditional indeed. I was also speaking with monks who do not yet today not allow women to be in the monastery, and they told me the same thing. For them, Takam Asi, you know, this that you are sentences like that, it's just, they are just simple statements of the fact. It's like that Kutuswami in Uttarkashi told me, it's like before I thought I'm fat, I'm thin, I'm mean, I'm intelligent, it's now that I know I'm dangerous. And yeah.
Okay, thank you. We have a last question.
No. I think in the interest of time, I'll forego making my comment.
Okay, so
Which would have been for Annette, and then we can talk about it.
Okay, good. So join me in thanking all of you. We can have 5 minutes break before the
Can we have
lecture today. Professor Webby.
Well, thank you. It's been a long couple of days. It's hot. Promise not to keep you longer than the appointed time. First, I want to thank Jenny Muswell and Robert for putting together a marvelous collection of people and papers, and for being kind enough to include me in this wonderful thing. And so, the title of this talk is Religion and the Making of Morality Systems. It has been said that Americans would sooner elect as president a Muslim than an atheist, on the grounds that an atheist, actually, of course, many Americans think they did elect a Muslim as president, on the grounds that an atheist having no religion has no basis for morality. Now, although much of my book, Ethical Life, is an argument against the assumption that religion is the necessary foundation for ethics, it's less clear why it seems so obvious to so many people who should know better. Thus, we read in a recent monograph in sociology the following: if today religion ceases to be a resource for public reflection and nothing replaces it, our values and morals lose their foundation. Now, my starting point, and much of which, the argument for which is laid out in the book I just mentioned, my starting point is the assumption that ethical life does not necessarily require religious foundations. When people come to think that ethics does rely on religion, this is for historic specific reasons that we should find puzzling rather than obvious, and whose consequences we should examine. So I first began thinking about how we understand ethics and morality while working on the conversion of Sudanese ancestral ritualists to the Protestant Christianity brought to their Indonesian island in the 20th century by Dutch colonial missionaries. One of the central challenges this situation presented was making, to me, if not to them, was making sense of how Sudanese were able to rethink and change ethical values which, in the face of it, should have been part of those background ontological assumptions that are so deep and so world-defining that they can be almost impossible to question. And yet, one day you are a Lahko ritualist, and the next day you're a Dutch Calvinist. In this context, however, ethics and morality seem to be relatively straightforward concepts. They were defined in terms of an institutionalized religion with an explicit moral code. Matters became more complicated, however, when I ventured into the less self-conscious domains of habitual activities and everyday relations that people like Dina Das and Michael Lambeck have called the ordinary, the domain of ordinary ethics. Now, as I use it, the term ethical life starts from that sheer everydayness. The mere fact, as James Layhall puts it, that people are evaluative. But as I began to explore other work by anthropologists, I discovered there was no consistency in how they used the words morality or ethics, which were often, in fact almost always, treated as requiring no definition at all. A glance over some of the major writings in the anthropology of ethics and morality illustrates the point. In The Gift, Marcel Mauss never defines morality at all, but clearly he has in mind those obligations between persons that constrain their self-interest. Tom Beidelman uses morality to refer to character traits. Wendy James, to that in their specific ethnographic context in Africa. Wendy James, to that which maintains a person's health and balance in the face of evil forces. For K.E. Reid, writing about Papua New Guinea, morality means rules and judgments, while ethics consists, by contrast, to the underlying concepts on which those rules are based. Arthur Kleinman seems to reverse this distinction, using morality to refer to ultimate values and ethics to speak of the explicit principles propagated by elites. Given this inconsistency, I have found it useful to keep in mind the distinction articulated by the philosopher Bernard Williams. Williams is critical of a dominant view in modern Western philosophy, certainly since Kant, which emphasizes obligations and blame and assumes they must be based on a wholly consistent system of highly general principles, which should apply to everyone, regardless of their identities and circumstances. This emphasis, which he calls the morality system, obscures other crucial aspects of ethics, he argues. Whereas morality deals with such questions as what one should do next, ethics concerns a matter of life, not a momentary decision, should I push the fat man in front of the trolley, but something that unfolds over the long term, that varies according to circumstance. Viewed from this perspective, ethics is less about choices and the rules that should govern them than about virtues, which involve, he says, characteristic patterns of desire and motivation. Although both ethics and morality say something about what one owes to other people and how one should treat them, they differ in how they portray social relations. Many of the most powerful rules and obligations of the morality system, such as Kant's categorical imperative, are meant to be universal in application and available to any reasoning individual. By contrast, ethics captures the way in which, as Williams puts it, the agent's conclusions will not usually be solitary or unsupported, because they are part of an ethical life that is to an important degree shared with others. In this respect, the morality system conceals the dimension in which ethical life lies outside the individual. This emphasis on the social nature of ethics is one reason why Williams's distinction between the two terms has been especially congenial to researchers working in historically and sociologically complex situations. It tends less to how ethics constrains people than to the ways it facilitates their ability to act and provides them with goals. It bears a strong family resemblance to the productivity of ethics, the productivity of ethics that attracted Foucault in his later writings. Now, we should not draw the distinction between ethics and morality so sharply that we are forced to exclude some of the phenomena we want to understand. As I read Williams, ethics does include the morality system, deontologies. It is just a special kind of ethics. It conceals, but does not eliminate the ways ethics is socially embedded, that is to say, morality systems. Conceal, but do not eliminate the way ethics is socially embedded. And the ethnographic and historical records are indeed full of rules and obligations put in very general terms, which are meant to be internally consistent, like the morality system Williams criticizes. We've seen lots of examples of these over the last couple of days. I have a visual image of a PowerPoint slide of the Ten Commandments on the tablets. Since these extend far beyond the tradition in Western philosophy that Williams had in mind, I would use the expression in the plural and propose that there are many morality systems, of which the tradition Williams attacks is only one example. Certain communities, following rules is precisely what the virtuous life is supposed to consist of. Now, assuming that Williams is right, it's still the case that many morality systems have been looming historical realities that we need to understand. Putting morality systems in the context of ethics encourages us to ask what circumstances tend to foster or induce the development of morality systems as more or less context-free, more or less explicit systems of obligations. The meaning of the word ethics as I use it here is very broad. It's tempting to follow the US Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart's famous definition of pornography. I know it when I see it, but this is unlikely to satisfy most people. So as a rough heuristic here, I think ethics is centered on the question of how one should live and what kind of person one should be. This encompasses both one's relations to others and decisions about right and wrong acts. The sense of should here refers to values, meaning things that are taken by the actor to be good in their own right, that is to require no further justification They are things that are taken by the act to be good in their right rather than as means to some other ends. This refers to that point where the justification for acts or ways of living just come to a stop, having run up against what seems to be self-evident, some inexplicable gut feeling, just the sense that that's the way it is. As such, values can also motivate the sense that rules and obligations of a morality system are binding on one's specific actions. One way to grasp the link between values and how one should live has been summarized by the philosopher Elizabeth Henderson this way. Value judgments, she writes, commit one to certain forms of self-assessment. That is, there is a crucial sense between one's sense of self-worth and what one values beyond the self. Emerson goes on to say that because the meaning that values hold is public, one's sense of self-worth is something that others can grasp as well. I will argue that indeed it's dependent upon that capacity for others to grasp it, which is where we come to semiotics. Now, many current philosophical and psychological discussions of morality focus on momentary decisions. Should I give money to a beggar? Should I push the fat man in front of a runaway trolley to save 5 others? Or, as William Godwin posed the problem in the 18th century, if I could only save one person from a burning house, should I choose to save the life of a great humanitarian or my own mother? His answer, by the way, is you should save a great humanitarian. What, he says, what is the value of this I, this me, such that I should not recognize the greater value of the humanitarian than that of my own mother, who happens to be a chambermaid in this case. But such momentary interventions are marginal to much of ethical life, and at any rate likely to remain evanescent. What makes an ethical innovation recognizable across different contexts, accepted within a larger community, and perhaps overriding competing ethical stances? And if they add up to a coherent and consistent whole, why might that be? Now, what Bernard Williams calls a morality system depends on the coordination of what might otherwise be disparate ethical ideas and practices. That coordination is not something to be taken for granted. Yet because morality systems are typically easy to see, they announce themselves to their rituals, their disciplines, rules, texts, authorities, slogans, laws, justifications. They loom large in the historical and ethnographic record. Their visibility makes it easy to forget that nothing guarantees that any given social world will produce a coordinated and explicit morality system. Or if it does, that the resulting morality system will actually govern people's ethical lives in their entirety. At the same time, if we rank against this bias toward morality systems and insist that ethics is really and only a matter of the unself-conscious habitual practices of everyday life, the other extreme that's been posed against us, it becomes hard to account for the empirical existence of morality systems when we do encounter them. Moreover, it becomes hard to understand certain kinds of actions, such as people's purposeful efforts to change ethics across entire societies. The reformer, for example, the radical, the revolutionary, the millenarian, the prophet. For morality systems loom large not just because they are easy to see, but because they play such a large role in history. Morality systems are often shaped by self-conscious people who stand apart from the taken for granted flow of everyday life in order then to be able to act upon it. Here we might visualize the Buddhist activist in Sri Lanka. Now, here I want to look at a specific kind of morality system associated with religious piety. Evangelizing piety movements tend to share a propulsive movement as large numbers of people take action in order to transform their ethical worlds. Given the evidence that much of ethical life is instinctual, habitual, fragmentary, contradictory, and does not require full awareness, how then do we make sense of those systems that push hard against all of those characteristics? What even makes it possible to step outside the flow of life and to look at it from a critical distance? So here I want to consider two thriving contemporary piety movements, one Christian, the other Muslim. Although they differ in their theological and moral doctrines, these movements have much in common. In particular, the participants in these movements actively and self-consciously strive to live ethically consistent lives. Both piety movements, that demand for consistency is partly explained, I want to argue, by the inculcation of a God's eye view, a version of the third-person perspective from which the faithful is expected to see the totality of his or her life and to impose order on it. Now, according to Williams, morality systems have a juridical character and imply the existence of a God-like judge that transcends the plane of human activity. Indeed, this is one of his reasons for dismissing him, because he's a good modern philosopher. There's no God. Ethics, by contrast, involves the growth or cultivation of persons guided by models or concepts of human flourishing that vary according to the social and historical context. If the quintessential morality system is a monastic order, the paradigmatic ethics is Athenian virtue. And yet, some ethical projects of self-cultivation, such as those of the Tibetan monks described by my colleague, the linguistic anthropologist Michael Lempert, do take morality systems as their model for human flourishing. They are often marked, these systems, by a high degree of objectification, producing explicit descriptions of acts, such as lists of sins, or types of person, for example, kinds of saints, that are readily cognizable. Morality systems support awareness with a host of semiotic technologies, such as texts, pedagogic techniques, rituals, and institutions to sustain them, like law courts, temples, and schools. These produce what we can call historical objects. They are objects because they have an explicit character that people can focus on cognitively, such as one might learn a set of rules. In situation X, do Y. They're historical both because they show persistence and stability, and because they are subject to transformations. Rules work in part because they seem to be the same even when they appear in different contexts. One reason they are subject to transformation is that, being explicit objects of awareness, they are easier to criticize and to defend than the unself-conscious patterns habitual life. This openness to criticism and defense makes ethics available for the purposeful endeavor, such as the religious revival, the social movement, or the political revolution. Historical objects are words or practices that make certain aspects of ethical life cognizable because they have semiotic forms that, being durable, can be recognized again and again. Words like sexism, practices like veiling and genuflecting have a degree of solidity in people's experience and can easily draw attention. Like descriptions of kinds of person, honest, sneaky, kinds of actions, generous, cowardly, whose reappearance in new settings can lend to the flow of events a sense of coherence. They are part of the raw material out of which everyday ethical awareness is made. This sense of fixity and palpability sets them somewhat apart from the background of those psychological processes and patterns of that characterize the flow of everyday interaction. An important part of ethical history is the way in which aspects of ethical life emerge out of this background and become historical objects. Now, semiotic mediation means that even inner thought, if it is to have any social consequences, is never just cognitive, but is inseparable from a host of material practices. Those practices, in turn, are embedded in ways of life. Having books, or a system of schools, or a monastic system, or in military orders, or yoga poses, will inevitably produce different results for ethical life than not having them. However, those consequences are not defined in advance. The existence of historical objects and the technologies and institutions that sustain them does not determine any particular ethical outcome. They afford reflections that may or may not catalyze change. Once those objects become part of the background of particular communities, they in turn offer affordances. Ritual practices meant to influence gods may become psychotherapy for atheists. Martial arts meant to train fighters might become meditation regimes for literati. Universities intended to train clerics for church and court become homes to laboratory scientists, nationalist historians, and textual deconstructionists. Now, assuming that what we call religion and ethics are in principle distinct from each other, what then is the conceptual relationship between the two? And the pragmatic. What are the historical pathways along which the two seem to converge? What are the social implications of that convergence where it occurs? And when they converge, what remainder escapes the conflation of the two? Our focus is on people's efforts on pious self-fashioning as analyzed in studies of two religious revival movements at the end of the 20th century. I trust many of you know them well. The charismatic Christianity of the Urabin of Papua New Guinea, made famous by Joel Robbins, and the self-cultivation of Muslim men in Cairo described by Charles Cushman. The Urabin are a small group of Highlands of Papua New Guinea, responding enthusiastically to a revival movement that swept the region in the late 1970s. They have emphatically rejected anything they associate with what they call the ways of the ancestors, working to construct a completely Christian life. To that end, they undertake frequent prayers, group spirit possessions, confessions, and take part in church services in which they are subjected to lengthy harangues about their lack of self-control. Robbins describes their condition in the 1990s as one of moral torment. The torment in question arises from contradictions between the older ethics that are embedded within the everyday activities and forms of sociality that are an inescapable part of their lives on the one hand, and the explicit precepts of the new religion on the other. For despite their rejection of the old religious practices, Urabin still hunt, they still work their gardens, they still enter into social relations much as before. Social relations depend on established forms of recognition, especially gifts and cooperation. To be a good person in this social world involves balancing two sets of demands. On the one hand, one should restrain one's willfulness in order to live up to the model of generosity, reciprocity, and helpfulness expected within established social relations. On the other hand, one should also work to create new relationships. To do this, however, means exercising one's will, which is likely to be at the expense of existing relations. For example, instead of giving meat to an athlete where it is due, one might give it to someone with whom one is developing a new connection. If the tension between morale, and part of the point here is, the background here is that the exercise of the will is itself taken to be sinful in this context. So if the tension between morality and the value of new relations already existed in pre-Christian society, it is brought to the foreground in the constant Christian attack on willfulness. Now, according to Robbins, Urabin think of morality in terms of law-like dictates. Their dilemma is thus implicit in the tension between the taken for granted domain of everyday practices, on the one hand, and the realm of explicit doctrinal teaching brought by Christianity, on the other. But the problem is even deeper. Their version of Christian morality defines it in opposition to any this-worldly calculations of utility. The very impossibility of perfectly fulfilling the demands of their version of Christianity is part of what defines a rule as being moral in the first place. This induces the sense that, despite their best efforts, they are ultimately doomed to live as sinners, because they persist in the ordinary, this worldly business of sustenance and communal life. Now consider now another religious revival movement, the subject of Hirschman's research with Muslim men in Cairo's lower middle class and lower class neighborhoods, also in the 1990s. Like the Arabian, these Cairenes are deeply influenced by religious currents that have been sweeping the globe, in this case, the Islamic revival. They, too, have made the religious movement their own, actively work to achieve profound moral transformations, both personal and social. This activist relationship to moral change takes place against an everyday background of modern urban life. Theirs is a community in which many, if not all, aim to make religious morality a dimension of everything, not just a specialized domain set apart from the rest of life. Like Arabian, these men find in Cairo ethical life to be difficult and requiring constant, highly self-conscious effort. But nevertheless, it remains an attainable goal, which can and should be integrated into daily life. One of the distinctive practices of these men is habitual listening to sermons on cassette tapes. As Hirschman puts it, sermon tapes enable their listeners to orient themselves within the modern city as a space of moral action. It is a technique of self-fashioning. Now, what's crucial then to the movement is its insistence that ethics does not require withdrawal into a pious enclave, kept pure by its barriers against an impious world, unlike, say, Hasidim or the Russian old believers or the Amish. Whatever torment may haunt these men is found not in contradictions within ethical life, nor even between that and their worldly context, but in the threat of hell for the unfaithful. That threat is represented in graphic terms within the sermons to which they are listening themselves. If these men aspire to ground their ethical lives in automatic bodily responses to religious summons, and this is what Hirschman emphasizes, that sense of wanting to make it so automatic that you never think about it, this is done through listening to highly explicit reminders of the afterlife that constantly prod them to see themselves from the third-person perspective that is provided by the God's eye point of view on their lives as seen from the perspective of death. Now, for all their differences, these two works portray movements that share a basic starting assumption that religion is the preeminent domain within which ethical reasoning and ethical action occur, and that the culmination of ethics is piety. Arabian charismatics and Cairene Muslims both treat theology as the necessary authorization and sufficient justification for ethical actions. Religious institutions and practices are the chief practical means by which the ethical life is shaped. Now, to be sure, such piety movements are typical neither in Christianity as a whole nor Islam as a whole. However, in one respect, the Arabian and the men in Cairo are exemplary of an influential strand of popular thinking in many parts of the contemporary world. This is the assumption that religion is the necessary ethics. The assumption that ethics requires a religious basis seems to be an important factor driving the present global religious revival. Now, Hirschman's account of the pious men in Cairo draws on ideas about self-fashioning, which emphasizes the role of mentors, role models, and other supportive resources in the individual's community. This view of ethics focuses on habits and practices embedded in the ordinary activities of everyday life. Available to consciousness or not, virtue in this view is not confined to particular domains of life. Any given aspect of social existence potentially bears ethical weight. This portrayal of virtue as habitual and pervading communal life has many of the hallmarks of what Marcel Mauss would call the total social fact. In his description of the gift, Mauss writes, he describes it as an enormous complex of facts. In these total social phenomena, all kinds of institutions are given expression at one and the same time. Religious, juridical, and moral, which relate to both politics and the family. In this characteristic passage, Mauss places ethical intuitions and expectations at the center of the everyday practices of law, economics, and kinship. The concept of the total social fact thus pushes back against the tendency to privilege religion as the basis of ethical life.
Although the modern division of labor attempts to sort out domains such as the religious, the juridical, the domestic, the economic, and the political, this, he argues, following Durkheim, is Weber, indirectly, is a historically specific and ultimately not entirely successful endeavor. But of course, history matters, and the sorting out of domains is enormously consequential. So what happens to the concepts and practices of ethics when they come to be identified with religion? So the rest of this talk, I'm sketch the following argument. Scriptural monotheisms tend to objectify ethics, exerting pressure on them to become more consistent and more cognitively explicit. But objectification also tends to separate ethics from everyday habits and to foster the taking up of a third-person perspective on life. This tendency is reinforced by the modern division among what Max Weber called value spheres. Paradoxically, this very division of value spheres, by identifying ethics with a specifically religious domain, can inspire strenuous efforts to break out of that confinement. The result can be the cultivation of piety meant to encompass all domains of life. And yet, the resulting piety project must still wrestle with the consequences of that initial objectification, consequences that tend to undermine that very goal. Now, both of the Oracle and Kybalion piety movements are monotheistic and scripture-based. They presuppose a category of religion that is already the outcome of a history of sharpening distinctions among different spheres of action. Religion in these movements emerges in contrast to the ubiquity and taken for granted everydayness that characterizes the social life. Many contemporary versions of the idea that ethics depends on religion derive from this distinction among value spheres. But some scholars of present-day capitalist societies have shown that value spheres are not so sharply distinguished, revealing ethical assumptions implicit even in practices that seem or are supposed to be defined by purely means-ends rationality, like those in business and politics. This is why even in bastions of free enterprise, I won't name any names, we can still see moral repugnance with the idea of buying and selling sex or selling children, which economic models should treat as wholly irrational. That is, the repugnance is irrational. It should be economically rational to buy. There's a market for children. If people want children and willing to pay a pretty penny for them. This repugnance need not have a specifically religious basis. It can simply be part of the largely unself-conscious ethical intuitions embedded within the everyday life of the community. By contrast, the spiritual monotheistic religions develop and inculcate a point of view located not in the immediate context, like the clan or the first-person position of a rational maximizer, but rather in the position of the person the person of a single supreme being. Whether they stress divine transcendence or immanence, monotheisms characteristically posit a unifying perspective that demands of ethical life that have a high degree of principled organization. The monotheistic perspective is expressed in the following remark about the effect of Islam when it encountered tribal Arabia. According to the religious scholar Toshihiko Izutsu, Islam marked the first appearance in Arabia of moral principle which was consistent enough to deserve the name of principle. A whole practical code of conduct, though as yet largely unsystematic, was imposed upon the believer. Prior to Islam, Arab moral values were just there as member disyakta, without any definite underlying principle to support them. Islam made it possible for the first time for the Arabs to judge and evaluate all human conduct with reference to a theoretically justifiable moral principle. When Izutsu sees this prior condition as merely the absence of principles, he is taking on the totalizing perspective of the monotheistic moral code. But the state of being what Izutsu calls member disjecta is hardly some failing peculiar to early Arabia. Rather, the ethnographic record shows that it is a familiar state of affairs. in the absence of some centralizing ethical project. The explicit goal of totalizing ethics under a theoretically justifiable moral principle stands in contrast to the totality implicit in the Mosian social fact. One that refers to ordinary social existence already thoroughly saturated with ethics prior to any regulating principles. Social interaction is saturated with what we can call the ethical stance, matters of values, obligations, the demand for recognition, the risk of its denial. These do not require any overarching organizing principle in order to have their effects. As the ancient Chinese philosophers of effortless action, Wu Wei, recognized, social interactions are usually most fluid, carried off most successfully by people who do not have to monitor themselves constantly. This does not mean that they can be understood without reference to evaluation, judgment, and self-awareness, only that these do not need to be organized into a single, coherent, and explicit system in order to have ethical effects. As I argued elsewhere, some ethical worlds accord a privileged role to self-consciousness, others to habit. But nothing in the concept of ethical life makes this a matter of either or, confining it wholly to one basis or the other. Now, one distinctive project of a monotheistic religion, albeit not confined to monotheisms, we see in Buddhism, Confucianism, and Jainism, seems to be the effort to rationalize ethics under an organizing principle, or at least positing a transcendental point of view is likely to instigate such effort. This is because such a point of view invites universalization that seems to demand principles sufficiently general that they can hold across an indefinite number of cases and contexts. These seem to be preconditions for both global proselytization and ethical generality. The point of view of a transcendent deity offers a position on which to stand, from which one can survey the whole range of known ethical values available in any given cultural world, such, and this is the crucial point, such that their inconsistencies become visible and a problem. It is the pressure exerted by this asymptotically transcendental point of view that provides at least a conceptual and ethical motivation for the kind of purification or reform movements that are so characteristic of this kind of monotheistic religious history. Now, one way to universalize and purify an ethical principle is to strip away particularities. Cost, however, can be a kind of debilitating dematerialization and undermining of social relations. Robin says that prior to their conversion, Moravian possessed techniques of self-formation, such as observance and sacrifice, that allowed those who employed them to achieve the telos of living as good people, whose wills were under appropriate control. Christianity, in proclaiming their codes false, also condemns their practical means of self-formation. In doing so, it leaves the Oravan without any way to constitute themselves as ethical subjects in their relations with the spirits or things of this world. They are left instead with a Christian ethical system that counsels them to look to their inner lives as the only target of their ethical efforts. Now, this is not to say there are not alternative practices available in the monotheistic traditions. I mean, that's sweeping statements are fine, but let's recognize. I'll give a nod to the complexity of this story. But the transcendentalizing move always seems to contain a latent possibility, the invitation to further purification, as we see in iconoclasm, anti-ritualism, and other attacks on the material things and practices that prior religions had made use of. A universal abstract ethical principle is not likely to render itself immediately inhabitable. Some further specification and mediation is needed if it's to become practicable. Perhaps the most ubiquitous medium for rendering an abstract theology accessible is in textualization. By textualization, we refer to the processes by which specific chunks of discourse are rendered into texts by eliminating or altering linguistic features that ground them in a specific context, such as first and second person pronouns. As text, they are transportable away from particular contexts in order to circulate among a potentially indefinite range of other contexts. where they have the potential to be recontextualized. More generally, the process of contextualization is virtually by definition what makes a so-called scriptural religion. At the conceptual core of scriptural religions are the products of contextualization, texts extracted from one context that can have powerful effects when recontextualized in another. Scriptures, creeds, catechisms, liturgies, sermons, prayers, hymns, and so forth. The practices surrounding these texts, studying scripture, reciting catechisms, are also crucial to their realization and adherence to lived experience. Now, to be sure, these practices coexist with meditation, pilgrimage, sacrifice, trance, dance, charitable works, and so forth. But it's often those texts that are the point of distinction between more and less legitimate religions in contemporary nation-states. Asia, possession of scripture is a necessary component to be legally recognized as a religion. These texts are often highly explicit. This explicitness reflects the way in which the scriptural or doctrinal text is available as a reply to some kind of demand that will provide foundations or reasons for ethical claims. Now, to be sure, many religious texts are obscure, even opaque, and all of them require interpretive strategies if the reader is engaged with them. But they are discursive in their very nature. They are texts. They represent ethics in words, a process that already involves a degree of distance from embodied practice and of generalizing beyond particular circumstances. Consider here the Quran. A multi-stage transmission from revelation by the archangel Gabriel to the speech of the Prophet Muhammad, to its inscription by scribes at his dictation, thematizes the contextualization process. The authority of the text that results cannot be wholly detached from this chain of transmission. The ethically authorizing nature of the scriptural text is clear. Zutsu writes that it is one of the most characteristic features of Quranic thought that it conceives of religion in terms of the guidance of God. In this conception, the religion in the sense of Islam is nothing other than ihtida, which literally means to be rightly guided or acceptance of guidance. This is but a corollary of the basic fact that in the Quran, revelation is regarded as essentially a merciful guidance for those who are acting to believe. Indeed, even the casual reader of the Quran would not fail to notice that through the whole of it there runs the fundamental thought that God guides whom he will, or, which would logically collide with the preceding, this is still Zutsu, I apologize for the long quotation, that God is absolutely fair in giving guidance graciously to all men, but some people accept it, while others reject it, of their own free will. End of quotation. Now, I want to point to three things about this passage. First is the emphasis on direction. Scripture may offer all sorts of things: theodicy, eschatology, ontology, mythical exemplars, models for poetic language, compelling parables, liturgical texts, political legitimation, and script for performances. But what really matters in this context is its role as a medium for conveying divine guidance for the ethical life and practical advice on how to live. Second is the strong sense of exteriority. Ethical guidance, by this account, comes to people from something beyond them, something that they can accept or reject. Indeed, this separateness is a condition of its ethical character, understood in this context, to the extent that ethics here depends not just on adherence to a law or a ritual procedure, but that it is a chosen adherence, since one could have rejected the law, like Iblis, like Satan. That is, although submission is definitive of Islam, it must in principle result from an act of free will. The transcendental nature of this divine point of view posits a single organizing vision on what might otherwise be a fragmented field of ethical norms and moral injunctions and habits. Zutsu's memory disjecta is implicated in its separateness from humans. Now, certainly this is only one, albeit highly orthodox version of Islam, and it is speaking within a theological discourse rather than responding to the particular needs and expectations in problems of domestic life, politics, law, art, commerce, and so forth. But it shows how Islam connects ethical behavior to the knowledge of the truth about reality. Ethics hinges here on accepting truth, which is revealed in science, ayat, as the Muslim theologian Rahman puts it. In order to determine the meaning of a sign, one must have, in addition to reason, a certain disposition, a capacity for faith. Immorality in this life is tantamount to willful disbelief, which involves the denial of the signs of the Creator. Thus, the factual assertions of the creed, as mediated through their signs, are foundational to the ethical demands of the moral system. Now, this way of linking assertions of belief to ethics forms a marked contrast to the more or less passive everyday ethics embedded in social interactions that Williams and perhaps most anthropologists emphasize. These do not require a particular set of explicit truth claims for their moral authority. This is one reason why notions of sincerity tend to be so much more prominent in creed-based religions, since acceptance of truth claims is so closely linked by them to ethical judgments. It is this reference to truth claims and the textual organization of those truth claims that helps give the sense of coherence, of being a matter of context-independent principles to scripture-based ethical systems. The demand that ethics be based on a small number of ethical principles that are fully knowable reflects this link to knowable truth about the world and its roots in the transcendental perspective from which the alternatives seem to be merely incoherent. So many membra disjecta. For all their differences, both the charismatic Rahman and the sermon-consuming Kyrenes take ethics to depend on heightened awareness, both through doctrinal knowledge and constant self-monitoring. This awareness is reinforced by the tensions and conflicts between piety and the unmarked habits of daily life. For even the goal of rendering piety a matter of deep, instinctual everydayness, which is what Hirschman emphasizes, seems to require that the pious maintain constant alertness to the impious possibilities around them. Both the Rahman and Kyrene cases, this tends to result in ongoing struggle. This is due in part to how religion has become a distinct category within a world of secular institutions, mundane activities, and less pious contemporaries. The more the faithful identify ethics with piety, the more unethical those less pious people and less pious practices amongst which they find themselves every day are likely to seem. Yet unless they follow the route to separatism, those who aspire to piety cannot wholly abandon every one of those habits and social relations that tie them to other persons and practices, at least not without social difficulty and personal loss. This difficulty is not just a practical matter of making a living and sustaining bonds of kinship, neighborliness, or workplace fellowship, though it is all of those too. Beyond those practical matters, those everyday habits and relations are likely to possess their own ethical implications, whose pull may not simply be eliminated by the ethics of piety. Ethics of your relation to your fellow workers, to your classmates, to your parents, to your children, to your neighbors. Piety notwithstanding in everyday life, one is still likely to acknowledge that a decent person owes something to kin and colleague. Referring to other research in contemporary Egypt, James Laidlaw comments that sincere followers of reformist Islam also think and feel in moral registers other than those of piety. They care about and aspire in terms of social justice, community, family obligations, respect, good character, romance, and love, and self-realization. And these can all be in conflict in various ways. Paradoxically, this is by including two sentences. Paradoxically, the totalizing pressure for the full integration of pious personhood appears to stem in part from the very distinction between religion and non-religion that it seeks to overcome. These persistent tensions seem an important source of the restless and relentless urgency of those revival movements that identify ethics with piety.
Unfortunately, we have only 16 minutes before the building is shut down, so I would propose to take 8 minutes of questions and have 8 minutes of answers. Please, that's enough.
Yes. Thank you for your fascinating paper. I have 2 short questions. The first one, you mentioned at the beginning ethical stances. Well, Charles Goodwin tries to define stance as a strategic use of body and strategic display of emotions in order to produce alignment or distance from certain social relations. So the use of body and emotions in the framework of participation. So the first question is, how would you put passions within your analytical frame of ethics? And the second question, you took this forward, this idea of ethic evaluation from James Lecco, ethic evaluation of action, which is a semiotics of sanction. So, but can we shift the problem to how people manage to impose their own evaluation on the evaluation made by others? So we go back to semiotics of manipulation instead. Thank you.
Tom? Okay. Well, I thought the goal of trying to liberate ethics from religion. I don't think we've gotten there in this talk yet. But what's more,
there's an easy answer to that.
we need more. But what really strikes me is, in general, that the anthropology of morality and ethics is surprisingly silent about the problem of evil.
Evil.
It's almost all about what, again, you should do this, you should do that, without really getting to the core of what's at stake. Why should you do this or that? I mean, all things being equal, it's not that much of a problem. As you said, whether you sell sex or sell children, unless there is something really at stake, unless there's the possibility of losing something important, maybe your humanity, of some kind of danger or destruction. So, in fact, in a certain sense, morality and ethics would be moot without evil. And in saying that, I also would say that just as morality can be found outside of religion, so the evil can be found evil as a human problem, and not necessarily just as a theological problem. So my question is, are you just like the rest of the anthropology of morality and ethics that has nothing to say about evil, or do you have something to say about evil in relation to morality and ethics?
Very short questions from Hans, Eve, Michael, then Robert, then last 2 comments here.
Eve?
Yeah.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like where you're going with this, and I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the underpinnings of the ethics of everyday life, and if, given the kind of inconsistency and non-rationalized character of it that you're highlighting, if there's any way from that vantage point to push back against piety movements that accuse those that are not pious of having more.
Michael.
Yes, thanks. I'm a little bit disturbed about the at least implication that strongly in your talk that there was not in fact a system of morality and ethics among the Arapmen before the Christians got there, It's not described particularly by Robin, since of course he couldn't actually do field work on it, except retrospectively by calling it, to use Tom's word, an evil. So that's a very moot point. Those of us who worked in societies of small scale, of exactly that sort, find precisely within the contextualized cosmogonies that underlie ritual practice, and of course, in a certain sense, are projected from them, real systems of morality and ethics. I'm a little bit, how should I say, disturbed by the sense that you've given us that there's something, how shall we say, either concretely scriptural or in effect semiotically scriptural that founds, as it were, systematic systems of ethics.
Robert. Thank you for this talk. For me, it was so rich and resonant and thought-provoking. I don't have time to talk about even half of the many big ideas that are raised for me. But on this issue of monotheism, which seems central to your argument, I mean, first of all, of course, I agree with Tom that you would need to take into account also the evils associated with die mosaische Unterscheidung and the kind of notion of exclusivity associated with such traditions in which morality in many instances is limited to an in-group. Your two examples didn't get beyond that, but in terms of your central question about whether a moral system or an ethical system can do without God, in which you seem to suggest actually that there was an elective affinity, almost in a Bavarian sense, between monotheisms and ethics, which are universal. One needs a bit more history. I mean, what I would want is to hear your opinion, your thoughts about how this could be nuanced in order to get beyond the trope of monotheism. And of course, one way of pointing the necessity of doing that is simply that what you provided, it sounds to me, is remarkably like Weber's account of how the Protestant ethic, through its insistence on a radically transcendent God, ultimately leads to auto-surveillance, which does without the deity and the machine runs by itself. And thus, obviously, the answer to the question, if we follow along this line of reasoning, is there's no need because we now have capitalism. And also, it reminded me of Bentham's Panopticon, which if you read it carefully, and Foucault doesn't point this out, seems to me, and I'm a Benthamite, I even know I love the crazy guy, is very transparently an attempt to establish exactly what you refer to as this internalization of the God's eye view, even, as Bentham says, when the guard in the central tower, who cannot be seen, is there. And so at both of those points of inflection, described by Weber and Bentham respectively, you can find the disappearance of this God who was originally, as I think you pointed out, monotheistic. So they've described the same kind of relationship or elective affinity between monotheism and morality, but then they've said, but it's clear you don't need it anymore.
Yeah, well, it's already been cut.
Note that in Bentham, the pronunciation of God and God was
very short.
Yeah, and just a common question on your final remark that the totalizing pressure of morality systems on ethical life come from the distinction between religion and non-religion, especially monotheistic religions. So that of course raises the question of morality systems that are not classified as religions, and whether they do not have the same potential of totalizing, thinking about in terms of national community, for example, very good example. The neo-Kantian system of relentless self-examination and self-critique. There you have the textualization, the link of everyday life to Marx and Engels, and how that chain of contextualization is there. Whether there's anything specific about religion or monotheism, it's really the question here when you talk about totalizing pressures of morality.
Last
More?
Very short.
You already heard this talk.
Insofar as we want to separate out ethics from religion. I wonder if, and it ends up that ethics kind of starts to sound a lot like what we used to call culture, and how the events and then getting established.
All right. Start and then we continue.
All right, okay. First of all, thank you for touching on the ethical stats. So this is drawn from my book Ethical Life, which came out in November, and the big part of the book is an argument attempting to give an account of ethical stats as it is, as we can tease it out from the evaluative dimensions of largely of social interaction. Pretty much a lot of the work that I draw is on face-to-face interaction. And the stats being the capacity to make evaluative judgments and responses to what is going on between people, often at a subliminal level, which then has the capacity to be brought into forms of heightened self-consciousness through the sense of having to give an account of oneself to someone else. That's the point at which one comes to engage with the objectification factors. Oh, what I just did then was actually right, despite the fact that you took it to be wrong, or something like that. The question of evaluation, so how do we, the question of how we impose those evaluations on others is a very important one. And it's a semiotically saturated one. So the business of propaganda, proselytization, missionization, and so forth. So what I can say is that those processes draw on the rudiments that I try to lay out as part of it there. It's a lot more than I should say there. Tom, I disagree. I think, well, first of all, yes, it's true the anthropology of ethics is concerned about evil. I think there's a reason for that, and that is because evil, as you were conceptualizing it, I take to be historically very specific to certain kinds of religions. And it is, I think it would be a real stretch to say, go into somebody's Marapu, the world of somebody's Marapu worshippers and followers, and say there's a concept that of evil there. I just don't think, I think that would be the projection of a Christian, Christian cosmology, ethical cosmology, a place where it just isn't to be found. It's what's at stake, there's a lot of...
That's just false, man.
What?
That's just false. Evil is found all over the place. I've heard that.
Well, you're a better Christian than I am.
I've heard that before. That.
All right. Well, we have a real disagreement here. We have a disagreement here. I mean, this is just a disagreement. Now, I may feel there's evil, but it would be wrong for me to say that evil is part of somebody's life. So what's at stake is what is the value of life, not something that has to be cast in terms of on good and evil. To answer that question really would be to try to recapitulate the argument of the book. So I think that's more about the underpinnings of ethics and real life. In the 4 minutes remaining to read, I'm not even going to try, but we can talk about this. But really, this is advertising for the book. Michael, there are two quick things to say about that. The first of all is, yes, it is. I was trained as an ethnographer particularly when you go to East Indonesia, which is saturated with Leiden School of structural anthropology, is any ethnographic role is not properly described until you describe its underlying systematicity and coherence. That is there for the ethnographer to elicit and construct. However, it is not there in the explicit self-consciousness of the people you're working with, and that's the crucial difference. I simply disagree with the idea that ritual and myth fully account for the ethics of life in the society. Even the exchange systems that Marcel Mauss describes, they're the ethics of the...
Christian doctrine doesn't describe life in the societies where it's...
I completely agree. The difference is that it teaches you that it ought to. It's asymptotic, you can't reach it, but the idea is that cities do not live according to the idea that there is an objectifiable systematic moral system that they should aspire to. And I think you can distinguish that from the ethnographer's task of constructing the underlying systematicity from the surface evidence. Let's see. Robert.
Monotheism.
Can't read my handwriting here. But the history, I mean, we can of course get into the historical specificity. I guess what I'm trying to get at here is if we don't assume, as I think Michael's going to say, that all cultural worlds are wholly consistent and are knowably so to their inhabitants, then when we encounter the aspiration to consistency, how do we account for that? And there are going to be, an indefinite number of historical stories to tell there, but I'm trying to find some sort of overarching basis for that. And you're absolutely right. I mean, favoritism or surveillance. So it doesn't stop with religion, but the third person point of view. This is getting, I think, also to Patrick's question to some extent. The non-religious morality systems in their yearning for totalization and coherence, such as Kantian deontology, such as Rawls, are such as communism. I have a chapter of my book is about the Vietnamese Revolution, Ho Chi Minh is a moral exemplar. Communism provided a third-person point of view, which was a Marxian model of history, which essentially provided you a stance, a godlike stance from which you could see the totality and then judge recognize the inconsistencies in your life. That must be rectified. But what I would say that, in cases, what they all, I would argue, historically depend on at least the semiotic mechanisms that were first developed in religions. That teach one how to take this exterior view, totalizing view on the world that you're living at, and then carry it over into a non-religious. They have into a non-religious or towards non-religious goals. Ethics sounds like culture. And I think, Courtney, I'm never going to have to say, you have to read my book to see what the distinctions are, because it's much too complicated to get into in the. We're now going to make it 30 seconds. We're locked in here for the night, so everything we can have.
I think we should do
Thank you. Well, those are great questions. They're really good questions. Thank you.